Okay, well, I think we might start. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Parliamentary Library special event, True Crime, Sex, Drugs and All That Jazz. My name is Victoria Vaughan-Smith, currently the Acting Parliamentary Librarian, but ordinarily the Manager Client Services in the Parliamentary Library. As I begin today's presentation, I should like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal people here today. For those who've attended previous presentations in the Parliamentary Library, this is a slight departure from our usual format in that today's presentation will be recorded. And a warning, this recording will contain adult themes, violence, drug use, sexual references, and parental guidance is recommended for those under the age of 15. Okay, so true crime, sex, drugs and all that jazz. In 2024, the New South Wales Parliament celebrated 200 years of the Legislative Council. Today we go back a mere 100 years to a very different period in our history, bookended by 2 world wars. 100 years ago, the war to end all wars was over. The world had survived a major pandemic, the Spanish flu. Eager to put the horror and drudgery of war behind them, people began rebuilding their lives. The 1920s were an exciting period. Returned soldiers were coming to grips with what they had experienced and re-establishing their place in society. The Jazz Age was coming into being, and hope permeated across many sectors of society, heralding a time of social, political and cultural change. It was a time of hope and an exciting new world, but not for everyone living in it. Sorry. But not for everyone living in it. An intersection of unfavourable social conditions, well-intended but perhaps wrong-headed laws, and a group of ambitious and ruthless crime entrepreneurs created a perfect storm in which vice could flourish. It's this relationship between crime and the workings of Parliament that we're exploring today, and how restrictive laws on alcohol, prostitution and weapons unintentionally created a thriving black market for the working class. So, until the early years of the 20th century, there were various activities that were largely tolerated and or in fact legal. So things like all-day drinking. When I say all-day drinking, it meant that the pubs didn't close at a particular time. Narcotics use, street prostitution, handgun ownership, and off-course betting and gambling. Turn of the century, of course, brought in a new age. Church, temperance organisations, moral reformers pressured the state government to cleanse Sydney of vice. So what we are seeing here on the far left of the screen is an illustration of a typical larrikin. So where this is a cartoon from the Bulletin, and it depicts the typical larrikin attire. So the way Banjo Patterson described the larrikins, black bell-bottom pants, no waistcoat, a very short black paget coat, white shirt with no collar, and a gaudy neckerchief round their bare throat. The boots were marvels, very high in the heel and picked out with all sorts of colours down the sides. The style, of course, was actually meant to show that they weren't carrying a gun or a sword, but they were possibly carrying a razor in their hat or in their shoe. The Rocks Push was a notorious larrikin gang which dominated the Rocks area of Sydney from the 1870s to the end of the 1890s. Of course, the middle picture there, worse for wear, depicting someone who is obviously into the all-day drinking. And then closest to me, a shot of Bow Street in Surrey Hills. This area apparently was demolished in 1913 before the First War had begun. So what was happening in terms of the passing of acts? So even though we're focused on the 1920s, there were certainly attempts to pass laws that dealt with some of these issues. So the Vagrancy Act of 1902 criminalised various behaviours deemed undesirable, such as begging, consorting with criminals, and having no visible means of support. The Act focused on controlling and punishing rogues and vagabonds and could result in imprisonment. And we also had the Vagrancy Amendment Act of 1905. Its primary purpose was to declare the gambling games of Fantan and Pakapoo to be unlawful. It made it an offence for a person to sell tickets or shares in these prohibited games, treating such offenders as rogues and vagabonds under the 1902 Act. There was also the Gaming and Betting Act of 1906. It placed restrictions on lower class entertainment, closing all sorts of betting shops, restricting betting to the racecourses only, and licensing racecourses. And also we had the Police Offences Amendment Act of 1908, which regulated aspects of public order and prohibited activities such as soliciting for prostitution, pimping and illegal gambling. The Act made it an offence for men to profit from prostitution. Hold that thought. It also defined offences related to the possession of stolen goods and provided for such warrants and penalties, for search warrants and penalties. So we'll move into the period now that we want to examine today. So only a stone's throw away from Parliament House was the area that became known as Razorhurst. So here's the typical lurid headlines of the time from a publication called The Truth. This is actually from September 1928. So this whole idea of vice in the inner city was certainly well established by this period, and there was pressure on the government to do something about this and clean up the area. So the suburbs of Darlinghurst, Woolloomooloo and King's Cross in Sydney in the late 1920s and 30s was a world in turmoil, with vicious razor gangs battling for control of the criminal underworld. And here's a picture. So on the left-hand side there we have a contemporary map of the area, just showing you Paddington there. Up in the top left, you can just see the outline of Hyde Park. This more modern map obviously gives you a little bit of a better idea of the area we're talking about. So here we have Hyde Park. Just north of that, the Macquarie precinct, the hospital, Parliament House, but the area that we're focused on, literally a stone's throw from Parliament House across the Domain. So it's this area here that became known as Razorhurst. But how had things reached this point? So let's start with the evolution of razor gangs. How did they take hold and why a razor? Sydney's criminals had always kept handguns and knives in their armoury. Many of these weapons had been retained illegally by soldiers returning from World War I. But when the Pistol Licensing Act of 1927 ordered a prison term for anyone with an unlicensed firearm, outlaws began carrying another weapon, a sharply honed cutthroat razor. So, and here's a picture. Here I have a modern take on the cutthroat razor, but as you can see, it's a slightly smaller blade. Here's the typical cutthroat razor of the period, often referred to as a Bengal razor as well, based on the brand. The other two lovely dressed gentlemen we have here are in fact this photo was taken by Central Police cells in 1920, shows De Gracie and Edward Dalton. And if you can see very closely, there's just the indication of, in fact, a razor slash on his face, and that was the typical L shape mark left by the razor. So cutthroat Bengal style straight shaving blade could be bought for a few shillings, or a few pence in fact, at any grocer's or chemist. It could be carried in a suit pocket, and if stopped by police and accused of having a concealed weapon, the gangster could say, "Oh, give me a break, officer, I was just going home for a shave." But what about earlier legislation? Surely this wasn't the first act to tackle firearms and illegal guns. So the government had considered similar restrictions at least as early as 1905, after several children were accidentally killed with firearms. The Gun Licence Act 1920 required all gun owners to hold licences and restricted gun ownership and use for persons under 18. The legislation proved impractical, highly unpopular, particularly with farmers, and was repealed in 1927. The Pistol Licensing Act, though, of 1927 was an attempt to criminalise unlicensed and concealed weapons. But of course, illegal firearms weren't the only problem. Cocaine hydrochloride had been imported into Australia since the 1880s, when it was widely used by the general public in the form of patent medicines, health tonics, nerve tonics, and of course Coca-Cola. It became increasingly problematic, its use into the 1920s, and that led to a ban on the sale and possession of cocaine, except with a doctor's prescription. This prohibition was then followed by a rise in the black market and organised crime involvement. Regarding the cocaine trade, cocaine was still used in various procedures, for example, dental procedures, although it was falling out of favour. By this period, most people had recognised that there was something not quite right about cocaine, and people were likely to become addicted to it. However, that meant that excess cocaine was sold by dodgy doctors and pharmacists to the illicit drug trade. So we have the selling of cocaine for non-medical purposes. There wasn't, of course, an attempt to deal with this. The Dangerous Drugs Bill of 1923 was introduced to regulate the manufacture, possession, supply and use of certain dangerous drugs, and to amend the Police Offences Amendment Act 1908. Unfortunately, it only ever reached the first reading stage and then it lapsed. In order to combat drug trafficking and to assist drug addicts, a Drug Bureau was established in June 1926 and consisted of all of 2 police officers. Detectives, Sergeant Tom Wickham and Constable Wharton Thompson, and these 2 gentlemen feature quite heavily in a lot of the news articles of the day. In late 1926, a bill was finally introduced to give increased powers to police in dealing with dangerous drugs. This was the Police Offences Amendment Drugs Act 1927. So, cocaine. But we've also heard the term sly grog. So what does that mean? Because New South Wales never had prohibition in the same way as the United States. So here we have a few headlines from the papers of the time. I do love this one of a Queenslander complaining about the lack of nightlife. Clearly, Queensland didn't have the same restrictions on service of alcohol as New South Wales. So, the 6 o'clock swill was an Australian and New Zealand slang term for the last-minute rush to buy drinks at a hotel bar before it closed. So 6 o'clock closing was in fact introduced during the First World War, the Liquor Act 1916, partly as an attempt to improve public morality and partly as a war austerity measure. Before this reform, most hotels and public houses in Australia closed their bars at 11 or 11:30 in the evening. So this was introduced as a temporary measure in 1916, And New South Wales government brought in temporary extensions and discussed putting the matter to a referendum. But in 1923, without testing the matter by popular vote, the New South Wales government enacted 6 p.m. closing time. And to be expected, the rise of after-hours drinking venues. Kate Leigh, who features in this photo here, the sly grog queen, fitted out her better grog shops with comfy chairs, card tables, and in fact did deals with breweries and had deliveries made to her network of Surrey Hills establishments. So we're not talking moonshine here. I mean, that's not to say that there weren't nice, backyard stills running, but this was a crime figure making deals with legitimate businesses, recognising that actually after 6 o'clock people did still want to have a drink. Supply and demand. So I just wanted to actually say something about this photo of Kate Leigh, who you've probably heard of. So Kate Leigh, the sly grog queen, a Dubbo girl, got in a lot of trouble in her early years, finally moved to Sydney, and not exactly to make good, but to establish herself. This particular photograph I like, probably taken by Vic Johnston, who was a famous press photographer, worked for The Sun, People magazine, Pics, all the way through from the 30s through to the 60s. So this was taken, in fact, as late as the 1950s when Kate was probably about 70. By this stage, her business had collapsed. She'd had a fight with the Australian Tax Office. There'd be, naturally, changes to drinking regulations. But this image, I think, holds a special power. She still owns her celebrity here in this image. So, Kate Leigh, obviously a name that we hear a lot associated with this period, along with Tilly Devine. So, who was Tilly Devine? Well, we have the sly grog queen, but Tilly was known as the Queen of Woolloomooloo. She ran a string of brothels centred around Darlinghurst and King's Cross, particularly Palmer Street. Tilly Devine had left the slums of London as a war bride, bound for Sydney in 1920, and over the next 4 decades she became a wealthy madam and one of the city's most formidable underworld figures. So how could Tilly Devine become such a successful madam? The Police Offences Amendment Act of 1908 made it an offence for men to operate a brothel, act as a pimp, or profit from the earnings of prostitution. In pre-war Edwardian world, men were pimps and women were prostitutes. Of course, the loophole was that this prohibition did not extend to women. In the post-war era, where women were now comfortably operating in a man's world, women could be just as exploitive as their male counterparts. So the next issue to deal with, consorting. So the Vagrancy Acts of the early 1900s that we spoke about had been designed to address such issues as begging and having no visible means of support, as well as controlling and punishing the rogues and vagabonds. The offence of consorting was introduced into New South Wales law by means of the amendment to the Vagrancy Act 1902. The Vagrancy Amendment Act 1929 added to the existing offences a new offence of habitually consorting with reputed criminals or prostitutes. The consorting clause was written specifically to assist in the destruction of the razor gangs. It was one of the most authoritarian and effective measures against organised crime ever. Police were given almost unlimited powers to imprison any citizen who had associates they deemed criminal. In anticipation of the Act's passage, the police formed a consorting squad and ordered it into action as soon as the new Act became effective in January 1930. Through the passage of this new Vagrancy Act and the formation of the consorting squad, together with the work of the Drug Bureau, our two officers, and a special vice unit targeting sly grog and illegal gambling, New South Wales politicians had finally given the police the weapons they needed for a frontal assault on organised crime. So, prostitution, sly grog selling were not eradicated, but certainly curbed by the consorting provisions. With regard to the cocaine, the consortos, as the consorting squad were called, and the Drug Bureau harassed and jailed street traffickers, shut down rogue chemists and dentists who'd been supplying the dealers. The so-called end of the cocaine trade put a serious dent in the infrastructure of organised crime because drugs and prostitution operated hand in hand. So, gambling has been mentioned as another vice to be controlled, but what was the situation in the 1920s and beyond? So again, a couple of interesting snips from the contemporary newspapers. What's happening here? Group of diggers playing two-up in France. So SP bookies, the racetrack. Historically, objections to gambling were based on a mixture of paternalistic and moralistic considerations. The first form of gambling institutionalised in Australia was horse racing. By the 1850s, every capital city in Australia had established turf clubs. By 1930, betting was permitted at racecourses with private licensed bookmakers and the totalisator only. Police turned their attention then to illegal off-course, SP, starting price, bookmaking, which boomed in the 1930s. We had the Depression effect, obviously. The poor were hard-pressed to afford public transport to the track, let alone the admission charge once they got there. It was far cheaper to stroll down to the local pub where a bookie with a telephone took their bets and they could listen to the radio over a beer or two. So, the SP business boomed during the 90s. Do you like that? The MLC, yes, we won't go there. Anyway, the SP business boomed during the 1930s. The rapid dissemination of radio sets and telephone connections created a communications infrastructure. Between 1914 and 1940, the number of telephone connections in New South Wales increased by 400%, with the largest increase between 1920 and 1927 when the number doubled. The increase in radio receivers was even more dramatic. In the 2 decades following the start of public broadcasting in the early 1920s, the number of radios increased from around 25,000 in 1923 to nearly 500,000 by 1941. So things were heating up. The decline of racecourse attendance and betting threatened the finances of the jockey clubs and the government. The Australian Jockey Club and proprietary racecourses applied pressure on the police and political parties to suppress off-track betting. Allegations of impropriety amongst police in their attempts to secure an arrest and convictions for street betting and starting price betting, in fact, led to the appointment of a Royal Commission in 1936 under Justice Markle to investigate the heavy-handed approach of the police. So, the Conservative Stevens government launched a major betting suppression campaign in May 1938. So just to explain what's going here, we have the typical David and Goliath depicted in this cartoon here. Our SP character, obviously the Goliath in this instance. And what we're seeing here was, in fact, a cabinet subcommittee was formed to investigate and what sort of legislation needed to be introduced. So the gentleman here with David with the slingshot is the Honourable George Gollan, who was head of this subcommittee. And I believe the other gentleman in the corner also on this subcommittee was John Dunningham, a former bookmaker. But I think the message here was whatever the government was going to do was probably not going to make a huge impact on SP betting in general. In fact, as one of my colleagues pointed out, we weren't quite sure what was happening in this cartoon, but in fact, Dunningham is holding a blancmange, and that's about as effective as any new legislation is going to be in dealing with SP betting. So, Stevens' government launches this campaign in May 1938 with the idea of introducing a Gaming and Betting Amendment Act 1938. The government's original anti-SP bill was introduced in July of that year, and it was harsh. It attacked every component of the SP operation. It proposed to ban broadcast of all but the barest news of race results. It made SP bookmaking a prison offence, and it ruled telephone or other transmissions of racing news from the course illegal. Naturally, the bill was hotly debated, and the press published daily reports on the progress of this bill. Despite a last-hour effort by opposition leader Jack Lang to have the penalties reduced, the new SP law was proclaimed in early October 1938. However, there were numerous indications of the continuing vitality of the SP enterprise. Unable to work openly in Sydney's hotels, many SP men retired to their telephones. Several of the largest bookmakers moved to Canberra, where they were exempt from state law and they could still maintain their Sydney networks. In fact, there's one story, one Saturday afternoon, on the eve of the war with Japan, Prime Minister Curtin tried to place an urgent call to the state premier, but encountered inordinate delays and learned that there were 60 SP calls booked before him. So in early 1939, the New South Wales government virtually admitted its failure. Colonial Secretary Gollan is quoted in the paper as saying, "Results of the SP Act have been reasonably satisfactory," he said. "We never aimed at 100% suppression," which sounds like a little bit of political backpedaling. By 1940, the SP bookmaker had returned to his place at the hotel and was operating as he had before the passage of the Act. Okay, so the end of the era. Sydney, on the brink of World War II, was a very different one from the one which had celebrated the armistice in 1918. The buoyant economy of the 1920s had given way to the depression of the 1930s. Ironically, Sydney in the 1930s saw major developments in infrastructure. The opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1932 and the City Circle Railway project both transformed transport and connectivity throughout the city. So with the onset of the Second World War, gang figures enlisted and went to fight in the European and Pacific theatres of that conflict. In 1935, though, the newly appointed Sydney Police Commissioner, Mackay, had summoned Tilly Devine and Kate Lee to his office and basically read them the Riot Act. Naturally, the competitive nature of these two operations, we'd finally had people being killed in the street. Things had clearly gone too far. So he said to the two of them, while he would not vigorously enforce anti-bootleg and anti-prostitution laws, he would enforce these new police powers, which granted his constabulary to be able to work against these women and their criminal enterprises unless there was an immediate mitigation of gang violence and cocaine distribution. So a truce was reached. Business declined. The Razor Gang era drew to a close. Even the arrival of US servicemen during the Second World War didn't reinvigorate the Lee and Devine criminal empires, and they now faced more competition. So both Tilly and Kate felt the effects of the Depression on their businesses and also spent various stints in jail. Kate declared bankruptcy in 1954 and died in 1964. By 1959, Tilly had to sell off her extensive property holdings in order to pay the tax office £20,000. So if the police don't get you, the tax office will. And she was left with only one brothel and her Maroubra house. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Any questions? Thank you. Well, while you're formulating any questions, Miss Overall, thank you.
I do note, and the 6 o'clock swill in New South Wales, but of course the ACT had prohibition from 1911 till 1927, introduced by King O'Malley, who was the Minister for Home Affairs. And of course they would all cross the border from the ACT, then the Federal Territory, into Queanbeyan in order to be able to drink, including when the old Parliament House was opened as well, and there was much chagrin because they couldn't get a drink on that side of the border.
Yeah, well, people will find a way.
And that was before America introduced prohibition as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that sort of a moralistic view about alcohol. I was overseas earlier this year. People were asking me, and where are you from? I said, Australia. Oh, right. And welcome drinks were being served. And I said, actually, I don't drink. Well, you mustn't be Australian. Anyway, look, thank you. If there aren't any more questions, I'd first like to thank the AVB team for their assistance today. Thank you very much. Also, a big thank you to Research Officer Rowena Johns for suggesting this theme and, of course, providing some fantastic background research on the various topics that we discussed today. And, of course, thank you to the Client Services team. Please, after this, do spend some time having a look at the display in the conference room. It's really great, highlighting some of the items that we don't often see, certainly not on this level of the library. So please enjoy, and thank you for being with us today.